We're going to continue with the 19th chapter of Superman, The Last Son of Krypton by Elliot S. Maughan. Superman has just let Luthor out of jail to go to Vega with him. He gave him a full presidential pardon. The reason I paused so early is there is a break in the chapter and we're going to get a longish Luthor and Superboy story starting right now. Superboy was impressed by the increasingly erratic nature of Luthor's behavior even before the Jefferson Baker science contest. The young hero was even more impressed, though, by the hologram project in progress, and supposed that Luthor's behavior was part of the pressure that comes from the process of creation. There is a high incidence of emotional instability, Superboy knew, among people in creative fields, like the one Lex was clearly entering. This deviance generally comes to an end, however, when the creator is reinforced by recognition. When Lex won the Jefferson Baker Scholarship, as he inevitably would, he would once again become the old, moderately tolerable fellow he was before he became obsessed. Meanwhile, Lex's arbitrations were jarring loose the collective emotional stability of the high school. During the time Lex was building his project, he evidently had some trouble creating a holographic image flawless enough to fool people who were standing nearby. His early efforts seemed as though they were flapping in the wind, or rippling as if underwater. He thought, at first, that people might overlook poor quality if what they saw did not appear to be a person standing on a stage, but in a tank of water. One day, when Coach Norm Levine led his first-period Smallville High swimming class into the indoor pool area, he saw, lying at the bottom of the pool, the figure of a young brown-haired boy in a crewneck sweater smiling cherubically. Alarmed, Coach Levine dove to the bottom of the pool and spent fully a minute and a half grasping at the rippling figure, trying to figure out why he couldn't get hold of it before he found himself on his back beside the pool with one of his students giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. A week or so later, in history class, Miss Carol Roberts asked Lex Luthor what Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson's attitude was toward the Whiskey Rebellion. Lex said that Jefferson was quite adamant in the belief that the federal government should put down any local rebellions before they spread to other areas like a virus. This was, of course, precisely the opposite of Jefferson's feelings, and Miss Roberts said so. "You've obviously been too preoccupied with other things, Lex, since you did not read the assignment. Is there anyone who can tell—" "Excuse me, Miss Roberts," Lex interrupted, "but I did read the book. I read the whole book the first week of school, and I remember just about everything in it." "I wish you would stay with the class, then, because you've got Jefferson mixed up with Hamilton. Is there someone who—" "If you look in the book, Miss Roberts," Lex was sweet as frosted flakes, "I think you'll find that I'm right." "Lex Luthor, that's twice in a row you've interrupted me. I think I'll do just that, since you seem so intent on embarrassing yourself. Let me see, that's page 213, Miss Roberts." She would have lost her temper at the third interruption if she weren't so sure of having the last word. "Yes, page 213. The book lay open on her desk, and Lex's finger under his desk pressed a bar of wires together as she read. "When asked if he thought Hamilton's actions were wise, Thomas Jefferson said, 'If I were Hamilton, I would douse the leaders in their own whiskey and set fire to—'" Miss Roberts squinted, looked closer at the page, and mumbled, "Jefferson couldn't have said anything like—" She looked up and saw Luthor lose the restraint with which he had held his mouth closed, fall out of his seat, and roll on the floor laughing. She sent Lex to the principal's office, looked again at the page of the text, which now said something quite different from what she had read aloud, and had trouble finishing sentences for the rest of the day. Unknown to Lex, Superboy interceded on his behalf on both these occasions. Superboy even asked the principal to ignore it when, following the incident with Miss Roberts, Lex laughed uncontrollably through the first 10 minutes of his half-hour detention period, stopped abruptly, mumbled something, and with a wild look in his eyes ran home for the day. Even Superboy had trouble accepting his behavior the next day when Lex showed up for first-period algebra, red-eyed from lack of sleep. The teacher had asked Lana to do a fairly difficult problem at the board in front of the class, and when she made an error, Lex jumped up and screamed something unintelligible. He pushed Lana out of the way, scribbled the solution to the problem, and angrily banged a fist on the blackboard, cracking it down the middle of his equation. No one in the room knew quite what to do, so no one moved. Lex stared at all of them during a forbiddingly painful 2.5 seconds of utter silence and then howled, "Why do I have to put up with this crap?" He exploded into tears. Clark Kent, hopped up to put a hand on Lex's shoulder. Lex hurled away Clark's hand and left the building. His parents didn't see him for 2 days. The story goes that Archimedes, for lack of parchment, used to work on the bench, drawing polyhedrons and circles and writing formulas in the sand. During the 2 days Lex was missing, Superboy saw him scrawling in the sand on the shore of Stafford Pond, a few miles outside Smallville. One of the 2 nights Lex spent there, he took 3 hours out to sleep under a clump of bushes, but other than that, he did not sleep at all. Almost catatonic, he stared at the lake for hours at a time. He paced, banged his fists on trees. He laughed. He hid from people who occasionally came by. He cried. He drew intricate diagrams in the sand. Secretly, Superboy uprooted clumps of poison ivy from where Luthor might walk in the dark, and otherwise left him alone. Superboy did not pretend to understand any of this, but he did believe that if the world was lucky, he was witnessing the blooming of a genius. Superboy did not know, Superman did not know, whether genius is a capacity with which some are born, or if it is a product of a particular juxtaposition of wonder and terror in a person's education and environment. Whichever was the case, it was happening here, and the hero wanted to be sure the process was allowed to run its course. After the contest, Lex came back to the lake, and for a week he did very little other than sleep. Lex was falling asleep. As a matter of fact, when Superboy plucked him off the bench and presented him to his new laboratory, Lex's eyes welled up. He lavished Superboy with thanks, and no one saw him for another 3 weeks. Some of Lex's classmates and a few of the teachers he had not yet intimidated left food outside the laboratory door. Clark was the only student that the Smallville High facility trusted not to copy answers that were often more accurate than the teacher's answer keys. Got the job of leaving Lex's tests and homework in the laboratory mail slot. Some days the food was gone in the morning, but it generally remained. Twice during the 2 weeks, the accumulated assignment pages were tugged in through the mail slot. The next morning, both times, they were in a neat pile, correct and completed on the ground outside under a basket of rotted fruit. No one ever saw the door open, not ever. Even Superboy had no idea what was going on inside. He had lined the walls and ventilation blinds with thin lead shielding. For 3 weeks, Lex was like a very mystical medieval hermit living in a cave. Legends say that the First World War was caused by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, that an apple falling on the head of Sir Isaac Newton brought about the discovery of gravity, that his murder of an Egyptian slave master in an instant of righteous madness sent Moses into exile to discover the wonders of God in the desert. The world might be much more orderly and interesting if these things were so, but it is likely that they are not. It is likely that the world would have gone to war had Ferdinand lived, that Newton would have noticed gravity if he had been sitting under a flagpole, that Moses would have recoiled from oppressive Egyptian society even if he had witnessed one fewer act of wanton brutality. When newspapers or magazines publish biographical profiles of Luthor the arch-criminal, when students in social studies classes discuss Superman's greatest enemy on Earth, when convicts who have served time at Pocantico talk of the singular brooding man with the red-lit eyes, they inevitably get around to telling the story of the day he decided to live outside the law, the day the laboratory burned down. Actually, it was coming for a long time. It was about 10:30 one night when Lex Luthor appeared outside his laboratory door and yelled, "I did it!" No one was around to hear him. He had his favorite audience. "I did it! Did you hear? I did it! Hot damn!" Smallville went to bed early. Sometimes only Superboy was awake, flying over the village, or over a nearby city, or to the moon if he felt like being even more bored. When Lex took off in a dead run across the field where his laboratory stood, tripped in a rut, rolled over and over onto his feet, noticing he had fallen, screamed through the streets, howling, "The Gametists are coming! The Gametists are coming!" Superboy was, in fact, on the moon, staring full face into the vicious sun, wondering what it meant to be a Superboy, or some such matter teenage boys traditionally ponder. Superboy was going through the familiar identity crisis period of adolescence and was trying very hard not to bother anyone with it. Today he would learn about guilt. Lex saw a light in the basement of Kent's General Store and pounded on the door until it opened. Lex expected to see Jonathan Kent or Clark being diligent about the books, or the inventory, or something. Instead, old Whizzer Barnes pulled the door open. "Hey there, young fella! What you doing prowling through the streets at this hour?" Whizzer had owned the general store before Jonathan Kent bought it. He was retired now. He hung a smile from his sagging jowls as he let Lex in. "You're Julie Luther's boy, right?" Yeah, I'm Lex. Is Clark around?" "I would think Clark's asleep by now, but just like I think you ought to be. I was just puttering around in the basement looking for an old records ledger I think I left behind. Got any beer? I gotta celebrate." Seems a man can't even do nothing at all if he's of a mind without some government fella asking where he made money, what money he's living on. You say beer, son? Yeah, like in a fridge or someplace? Mr. Kent must keep something like that around. Lex swung opened the door of a deep freeze behind the counter and found only ice cream. How about tobacco? Ain't been able to get beer in this town since 1914, before Prohibition. Yeah, a corncob pipe. Think Mr. Kent would mind if I grabbed this and paid him for it tomorrow? That was the year they passed the income tax. Folks thought it'd be a good way to keep away the revenuers. Lex stuffed the pipe in his pocket and clutched a 2-ounce pound of Flying Dutchman tobacco and flew out the door. Thanks, Mr. Barnes. Appears folks were wrong, though. Whizzer Barnes stood at the open door and stared after Lex for a long time. There was a look behind the boy's eyes he had seen only once before. He couldn't place it until he remembered an old man who had come to the store. Oh, it must have been 10 or 15 years ago. The old man moved slowly, hardly had any cheeks for the wrinkles over his face. He had a mustache, as Whizzer recalled, and had a wool cap pulled down tightly over his head. Lex and the old man didn't move or sound or act the same. What was it about the two of them? Whizzer thought he remembered. The old man had bought a corncob pipe and tobacco, too. Whizzer Barnes folded his ledger under an arm and shambled home. When Superboy entered the atmosphere of the Earth, there was smoke seeping out of the windows of Lex Luthor's laboratory. 4,000ths of a second later, the Boy of Steel crashed through one wall of the structure he had built 3 weeks earlier and out the opposite wall. The fire, with room to breathe, now spat its killing heat into the open air. Superboy scooped the unconscious Lex Luthor from the floor of the building, wrapped him in a cape to extinguish the flames licking at his clothes and hair, and set him down in an open field. When Lex awoke 2 seconds later, heaving air in and out of his lungs, he saw Superboy emptying his own lungs at Lex's laboratory, his fire, his creation. Lex raced to the falling building, howling at his rage. He got far enough to feel the heat, to need to cover his mouth and nose with a hand as he ran, to feel a hot prickling sensation over his exposed skin, to see the bowlful of living protoplasm he had created with his mind and hands and livid soul die the death that Lex at that moment wanted to die. Searing gas from the combustion of his artificial protoplasm killed the hair follicles of Lex's arms, face, and head. Only the hand he was holding over his nose and mouth when Superboy plucked him up, kicking and writhing for the second time, saved the cilia in his nostrils. He would never grow hair or a beard again. He would laugh or cry or become enraged when pansy philosophers wondered in the future whether laboratory life could have a soul. He would know that such life would have no less than the soul of its creator. Lex Luthor chose, from the moment of his creation died, to hate the being who had saved his miserable life. Who had saved his miserable life, who was responsible for the loss of his brown curls and his child. It was the only way he could walk slowly 1 millimeter at a time from the abyss of madness. Superboy came to understand as Luthor did. Not that while Luthor's soul might be as durable as that of any other creature in the universe, the vulnerable and sensitive body of a mortal can withstand only a certain amount of greatness before it must balance that with venality. And I will pause there.